But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. I still have a dream this afternoon. One day, inferior segregated schools will become a thing of a dark past. I still have a dream this afternoon.
The anger and frustration of American blacks, which led Martin Luther King into his tragic fight for civil rights, was what led to the 60s race riots when U.S. cities burned. Today, that bitterness is seen in city slums from Los Angeles to London. It's a communal black pain which has festered on the memories of the 11 or 12 million people who were uprooted and the 5 million or more who died in the terrible dark days of slavery.
Any discussion of the slave trade and of slavery must be conditioned by the premise that none of us can really understand the enormity of what it must have meant to be human property. And none of us should ever conclude that slaves as persons had Teflon-like personalities so they could walk away from that experience unaffected. What we really are unable to understand fully are the psychological dimensions of being chattel.
And this story of slavery is inextricably bound up with our story of disease and history. It goes back to when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. That was the first time the disease pools of the Old World met the virgin peoples of the Americas. The West Indies seemed so lush to the Spaniards. They could grow profitable crops like sugar. But the indigenous peoples didn't survive the disease onslaught from the European fleet. It's easy to imagine that the West Indies have always been black, but they haven't. The Spanish needed new labor to exploit their lands, so the colonialists looked for other sources of workers. But the only supply of laborers with tougher immune systems than the indigenous peoples was in Africa. But in going there for slaves, the Europeans were to unleash infectious forces they couldn't control. West African slaves went through an unprecedented process of fitness selection. In their distant homelands, the youngest and fittest would have been captured and taken to holding compounds to await the slave traders.
The old view of the slave trade used to be that ships simply sailed up to the coast and grabbed people, and this was associated with the belief that Africa was a savage and primitive place. In fact, the African societies were well organized, and African commerce was a developed commerce even before the Europeans turned up. So that what happened is that the Europeans attached themselves to existing commercial patterns and were able to buy slaves fed down to the coast in very large numbers. If you keep in mind the scale of this, it contradicts to some extent the old belief that Africa was a primitive and savage place. The Africans may not have been any more morally upright than the Europeans were, but they did in peak years in the 18th century deliver 100,000 people to the coast for sale to Europeans. That is a lot of people, and that requires a very sophisticated commercial network.
The slaves came to the ports from all over, from dry areas and from wet areas. And so most of the diseases of Africa got funneled down to the coast.
The forts or the coastal area represented a marketplace of disease. So it's an unholy exchange, so to speak, that reflected the varieties of disease environments on the coast and in the interior. This awful kind of thing continued during the crossing, where slaves tended to die from a variety of diseases, smallpox, the measles, dysentery, a variety of other kinds of ailments as well. And the members of the crew are dying from the same kinds of diseases that tormented the slaves.
Crews were people who had been born in temperate latitudes in northern Europe, let's say England or France. And when they went to the tropics, they lacked immunities against the tropical pathogens that they encountered there, principally fevers, black water fever, malaria, yellow fever, and so on. And so they would succumb to these tropical diseases, to which the Africans had a limited degree of immunity.
These diseases that killed Europeans in West Africa were then carried across the Atlantic by the slaves, and so that the tropical Americas came to be almost as dangerous as the tropical Africa was.
There was a constant need for new slaves because of enormous death rates. There was also a constant need for new European overseers, since the trade had transformed the Caribbean into a white man's grave. All of a sudden, the Europeans weren't such great colonizers anymore. They'd been confronted with people whose immune systems went back to the dawn of humankind. If you add imported African malaria and yellow fever, the European diseases like measles and smallpox, and awful sadism, then a sugar plantation became a pretty toxic place for everyone. A place where the population could never sustain itself.
We do have a lot of information about life on the Jamaican plantation, particularly the extensive diaries of Thomas Thistlewood, who ran one such estate, and in general, it was really an atrocious form of existence. Death was everywhere, disease was always present, and it was a very, very hard life. In this setting, floggings were a commonplace on the estate for the very simple offenses of malingering, for example, brutal floggings, 100 lashes administered by himself. For running away, it was not only a combination of very severe beatings before the other slaves, but often urinating and defecating in the mouth of the slaves when they're tied to the ground. He was incapable of producing on his estate young children who reach maturity. There is an abnormally high death rate. In the estate records are cases of venereal diseases which are rampant. Thistlewood infected most of his slaves because he had this habit of sleeping indiscriminately with every female over the age of about 14. And he continued to sleep with slaves even after he had arranged their marriages with slaves he owned. It is very hard to know exactly from the records what slaves thought or did not think. But what is quite clear from some of the evidence we have and from survivors of slavery is that women in particular who were brutalized by white men, who because they were slaves were abused sexually, felt that the one area in which they could get back at the white man was not taking his offspring into the world. And there are a number of cases where women deliberately attempted to commit suicide or poisoned their offspring. So that this is an indication of their reaction to the system of slavery, that while they had to endure it where they could, they would not perpetuate it.
And we have to say that the slave trade will forever remain a shame, an awful shame, on those who involved themselves in it, on those who engaged in it. And when you look at the mortality rates, which could have been as high in some cases as 40% or 50%, then the horror becomes magnified. But the other dimension of the trade, of course, is that it does demonstrate to some extent the resilience and the triumph of the human spirit. Because many of these individuals who underwent that process walked away from it, not necessarily unscathed, I don't think anyone could have emerged unscathed. But many of these individuals were not vanquished and walked away as persons with their personhood, with their dignity, with their sense of self intact.
The proud black Caribbean nations who are now their own masters are built on the terrible experience of slavery. It is a triumph of the human spirit, but it's also a triumph of the black genes which were molded in Africa. Europeans simply didn't have the genes to resist diseases like malaria, and to be successful colonizers, they had to resort to drugs and even botanical espionage.
Kew Gardens was one of the most important factors in the development of the British Empire. Explorers, botanists, gardeners from Kew traveled throughout the world looking for plants which might be useful in developing colonies.
When the British went to North America, there's no question they were the conquerors. But when they went to Africa, they were the ones knocked over by the germs. The greed of the English was being held up by inconvenient tropical illnesses. And what their colonial aspirations needed was some good medicine.
This is a cinchona tree growing here at Kew. It enabled Europeans to colonize and rule parts of the world that had been closed to them before because of malaria.
Originally, the cinchona tree was only found in the Andes. The indigenous peoples of that part of South America had found that when they boiled the cinchona bark, the juice helped some fevers. The bark actually contained quinine, an effective treatment for malaria. The Spanish who ruled the area controlled the quinine market and jealously guarded their rare and highly profitable product. In 1858, the British sent an expedition to get the trees. One of its members was Robert Cross, a gardener at Kew. Cross went off by himself with these glass cases and managed to steal 657 cinchona cuttings.
Now this is one of the actual Wardian cases which we used in those days for transporting plants. And it was in many miniature greenhouses like this that Cross brought his living cinchona seedlings down from the uplands of Ecuador on mules at first, and then on a balsa raft down rapids and whirlpools to the coast, and eventually put them on ship for England and Kew.
At Kew, they propagated the seedlings, and cuttings were sent out across the British Empire. Very soon, huge plantations were established from Jamaica to India to mass-produce the bark. Within 20 years, by about 1880, all this cinchona bark was providing European soldiers with cheap, plentiful quinine, which allowed them to go into areas where they had previously feared to tread. Before 1880, there were actually very few decent-sized white settlements in Africa. But by 1910, that had changed dramatically, as European nations sent in their people armed with the now affordable quinine. So almost for the first time, the colonizers didn't have to rely on their own immunity. A drug could defend them against the invisible armies of others.